the house that knew my name. Even now, the phrase moves through the quiet like a drifting lantern. Its glow soft, its meaning uncertain, tugging at something deep in the quiet corners of memory. Tonight, we'll follow that gentle glow together. This is Evelyn Blackwood, whispering to you from Midnight Murmurs Radio, where stories drift slow as autumn leaves and shadows behave just a little differently after midnight. Tonight's tale begins with a house that seemed to breathe, to listen, and perhaps to remember more than any person ever could. Before we enter that house, take a slow breath. Let your body sink into your pillow, your mattress soft beneath you, as though the world itself is holding you safely. Exhale slowly, letting the weight of your day melt, dissolve, fade like footprints in early snow. Close your eyes gently if you haven't already, and imagine a warm, dim space around you. No worries can reach you here. No noise follows you. Just the calm glow of a quiet night, and the soft company of a story meant to guide you gently toward rest. In your mind, step onto a quiet rural road, somewhere in old America, where the land stretches wide and open. You can almost hear the low hum of distant crickets and feel the cool breath of a late October breeze brushing past your cheek. The world is peaceful. Here cosies, comest, wrapped in a magical slowness that seems to deepen with every breath you take. A long fence runs along the roadside, paint peeling, wooden boards warped by years of sun, rain, and forgotten summers. Beyond it, the trees gather like an old choir, their branches swaying together as though murmuring the faintest lullaby. And there it stands, a house that shouldn't feel alive, yet somehow does. Its windows, dusty but strangely bright, watch the road with quiet patience. Its porch wide, creaking, sagging in the middle seems to stretch forward as though greeting you after a long journey home. Ivy curls along the railing like gentle fingers. The lantern above the door barely glows, but you sense it has been waiting for you, flickering softly, warmly, like a heart beating behind old ribs. The story begins with a traveler, Michael Alden, a quiet historian who has spent his life collecting forgotten stories of American towns, traces of vanished families, remnants of early rituals, the offbeat murmurs of frontier folklore. He arrives in this remote corner of Pennsylvania after receiving an unsigned letter, one written in a hurried hand. Come before the first frost. The house remembers you. He believed it had been sent to the wrong person, yet some tug beneath the ribs pulled him here anyway. Michael walks toward the steps, his boots tapping gently on the wood, each sound echoing into the deep hush of evening. Fireflies drift around him like floating sparks, their faint green light hovering near the porch as though guiding him the rest of the way. You follow behind him in imagination, your steps soft, your breath slow and steady, the air cool and nurturing, inviting you deeper into this dreamlike night. Michael reaches for the doorknob. It feels warm, as though a hand had just touched it before him. And when he pushes the door open, the house exhales a long, settling sigh, dust lifting in the slanted light. Inside, everything is still but not silent. The wooden floor beneath Michael's feet carries a faint vibration, a memory of footsteps long gone yet somehow present. The wallpaper, patterned with faded gold leaves, seems to shimmer in the dimness, like it's remembering autumns from decades past. And somewhere, deep within the house, a soft, rhythmic thump echoes slow, gentle, almost like a heartbeat. Michael steps inside, closing the door behind him, and then before he can take another breath, he hears it. A soft whisper. A whisper shaped like his name, Michael. The sound floats through the hallway, calm and airy, not frightening, not sharp. Familiar? Too familiar. Like a voice he once knew, in a dream long forgotten. He pauses, listening. The whisper fades into the wood, into the wallpaper, into the dust motes drifting in the lantern light. He tries to convince himself he's tired from traveling, that old houses have strange acoustics, that the whisper was nothing more than a coincidence. But the house feels awake now, as though it has recognized him, as though some long-hidden story has stirred from its sleep. Outside, the wind begins to move gently around the old walls, brushing the windows with a calming, rhythmic pulse. And as Michael takes another step inside, you can feel the world around you grow softer, quieter, more peaceful, as though this house, strange as it is, holds no threat, only memory, only whispers of history, only the gentle hum of something magical and forgotten rising to the surface. Let your breath flow slow and easy as the scene settles in your mind, because the story is just beginning. Michael stood in the front hall of the house, the air around him warm, with the faint scent of cedar and something older, something like the memory of autumn fields long abandoned. The whisper of his name had faded, but the echo of it lingered deep inside the wooden beams, as though the house had spoken not through a voice, but through memory itself. He inhaled slowly, steadying himself, and the silence that filled the space was soft enough to feel like an invitation rather than a warning. Outside, a pale wash of evening light filtered through the dusty windows. Dust motes drifting lazily in golden currents, as if the house were stirring awake after decades of dreaming. Michael took a slow step forward, the floorboards sighing beneath him, and for a moment he imagined the house breathing in time with him, each inhale expanding the walls, each exhale settling the rooms, everything aligned with an ancient rhythm he couldn't quite name. He moved deeper into the hall, letting his senses soften, letting the quiet wrap around him like a heavy woolen blanket. The house felt lived in, though untouched, as if someone had stepped out for a moment but might return any second. A row of old portraits lined the narrow corridor, their frames tarnished, their subjects cloaked in sepia haze. A woman in a high-necked dress, her eyes sharp with sadness, a boy with a lopsided grin, one hand clutching a wooden toy train, an elderly man whose expression looked halfway between stern and weary. Their eyes seemed to follow him not with malice but with a strange, lingering recognition. He paused before one of them, a young woman in her 20s, with dark hair pinned neatly back, her expression serene. Something about her pulled at him, tugging at a memory he didn't believe he had. Her gaze felt patient, as though she had been waiting for him to notice her. Michael leaned closer, breath softening, when a faint creak rose from the staircase behind him. He turned slowly, every movement gentle, and saw the railing tremble, as if someone had just walked down the steps moments before he entered. he whispered into the stillness. "Is someone here?" But the words dissolved into the glow of fading daylight. The house did not answer, but the air shifted, warm and calm, like a hand resting lightly on his shoulder, reassuring rather than frightening. He continued down the corridor until he reached an open doorway that led into a living room. The room was bathed in the deep amber of sunset, lighting the space with soft, sleepy warmth. A fireplace sat dormant but filled with old ashes, as though a fire had once burned there every evening for years. A rocking chair stood near it, gently moving just barely, its creak almost inaudible. Michael watched it sway, slow and rhythmic, a motion too steady to be the wind. The sensation that someone unseen was watching him returned, but it felt peaceful, like standing in the presence of an old friend who didn't wish to disturb him. He sat on the edge of a nearby sofa, the fabric cool beneath his fingers, and let his heartbeat fall into the same rhythm as the chair's faint motion. As he breathed deeply, his thoughts drifted to the letter he'd received, the one inviting him here before the first frost. It seemed impossible that this house, which he had never visited, could remember him. Yet everything around him suggested familiarity deeper than logic could explain. The comforting slant of the room's light, the quiet hum inside the walls, the gentle glow of something almost like recognition. His gaze wandered toward a small table near the window. On it sat a single object, an old brass key, tarnished but carefully placed atop a folded note. He hesitated, then reached for it. The key was warm in his hand, the metal pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. He unfolded the note slowly. On the paper, written in graceful lupin script, were 3 simple words. "Welcome back, Michael." His breath caught, not in fear, but in a deep, quiet pull of something that felt like truth. He didn't know how, or why, or what it meant, but the words resonated inside him with an almost painful familiarity. The house creaked softly, as though shifting in satisfaction. The rocking chair stilled, the golden light deepened, and Michael, sitting in the hush of a house that knew his name before he ever spoke it, felt the first threads of a forgotten story rising from the shadows, ready to be remembered. As the stillness settled around him and the house breathed its slow, ancient breath, the night outside drew deeper, quieter, waiting patiently for what would come next. Michael sat very still, the brass key resting warm against his palm, as though it carried a pulse separate from his own. The note beside it, "Welcome back." Michael seemed to breathe faintly with each shift of the fading light, its edges trembling ever so slightly in the quiet air, as if written by a hand that still lingered somewhere in the room. He let his gaze soften, allowing the room to blur into a dreamy haze, and for a long moment he simply listened to the house. It was an old symphony of subtle sounds, the soft groan of aging beams settling into night, the whisper of dust slipping across the windowsill, the distant hum of wind brushing against the eaves. None of it felt threatening. Each sound carried a calm, measured rhythm, like the gentle murmurs of a storyteller drawing breath before beginning another chapter. The warmth of the key grew more noticeable, curling around his fingers like a memory of holding someone's hand long ago. Michael rose slowly, drawn toward the window where evening deepened into a velvety blue. Outside, fireflies glimmered as though tracing old constellations across the darkening yard, their lights drifting with Pesci, almost reverent slowness. Beyond them, a line of oak trees swayed in the breeze, their shadows stretching long across the grass like ancient guardians keeping silent watch over the house. Michael inhaled deeply, the cool scent of night creeping in through the cracked window pane, damp earth, distant wood smoke, the faint sweetness of fallen leaves. Something in the air felt familiar, as though he had walked beneath those very trees in another lifetime, under another sky. The feeling tugged at him gently, urging him deeper into memories, soft, unlit corridors. He turned from the window and looked again at the portraits on the wall. The young woman with the pinned-back hair seemed to glow faintly now, her expression more vivid in the low light, her eyes filled with a quiet knowing. Michael approached her again, the floor beneath him echoing each step with reluctant sighs. The closer he drew, the more certain he became that he had seen her somewhere, not in photographs, not in books he'd studied during his years as a historian, but in dreams that disappeared the moment he woke. Her gentle gaze reached him like a hand resting lightly on his chest, steadying his heartbeat in a way he couldn't explain. He whispered softly, almost apologetically, "Do I know you?" The room held its breath. A soft wind brushed through the hallway, slipping through the cracks in the old wood, carrying with it the faint scent of lavender and something older, something like ink on yellowed paper or the leftover warmth of candlelight. The rocking chair near the fireplace gave one slow creak, as if acknowledging his question. Micah felt the pull again, that subtle, irresistible tug, guiding him not with urgency but with a soft insistence towards somewhere deeper inside the house. He held the key tightly, sensing that it belonged to a room that mattered, a room that remembered. Following his intuition, he crossed the living room, his steps merging with a soft chorus of evening settling into the house. He reached a narrow door at the far end of the hall, one he hadn't noticed earlier. The doorknob, unlike the front doors, warm metal, felt cool to the touch, sending a quiet shiver through his hand. The key fit perfectly, as though the lock had been waiting for its return. When he turned it, the mechanism clicked with a soft, satisfied sound, like a sigh of recognition. The door opened onto a stairway leading down a basement, though the air drifting upward was surprisingly warm and carried the faint aroma of old books and something floral, like pressed petals hidden between pages. Michael descended step by slow step, each footfall absorbed by the gentle hush below. The basement was dim, lit only by the thin glow of a lantern resting on a wooden table. Shelves lined the walls, heavy with journals, letters, and rolled-up maps. He approached the table, drawn to a single open ledger whose pages rustled though no breeze touched them. On the page, written in looping script, was a name, his name, Michael Alden. Beneath it, a date from over a century ago. His pulse stuttered, not in fear, but in awe, in recognition of something vast and quietly impossible. The house creaked gently above him, its voice calm, patient, as though urging him to keep reading. And as he stared at the entry bearing his name, the words on the page shimmered faintly, as if the past itself were exhaling, ready to tell him everything it had held for so long. Michael stood frozen before the open ledger, the page glowing faintly in the lantern light, as though lit from within by a memory older than the house itself. His name, Michael Alden, appeared in handwriting far too elegant to be his own. The Inca soft sepia that suggested it had rested on the page for decades perhaps a century. Beneath it, the date shimmered in his vision. October 21st, 1894. Long before he was born, long before even his grandparents existed. Yet the sight of it stirred a familiar warmth deep inside him, as if the memory belonged to him anyway. He reached out, fingertips drifting over the old paper, and the moment he touched it, the lantern flame shivered, stretching long shadows against the stone walls. The basement air grew denser, not cold, but warm and full, like the breath of someone standing right behind him, reading over his shoulder with silent patience. Michael inhaled slowly, steadying the gentle tremor in his chest, and turned the page. The ledger responded like a living thing, its fibers humming softly beneath his touch. The next entry was written in the same looping script. He has returned. The house remembers. The cycle unfolds once more. The words pulsed with a faint glow, and Michael felt a subtle pressure in the air, as though the room leaned closer to him. He swallowed, but his fear softened beneath the overwhelming calm that filled the space. It was like being held in a warm embrace by someone he couldn't name. He turned another page. This one bore a sketch, a detailed pencil drawing of the young woman from the portrait upstairs. Her eyes carried the same gentle sadness, he recalled. But in the sketch, she stood on the porch of the house, one hand resting on the railing, her other hand extended as though offering something just out of sight. Beneath the sketch was a name, Elara Whitcombe. The name drifted softly in his mind, stirring something that felt like the remnants of a dream he had woken from too soon. He whispered it under his breath, "Elara." The lantern flickered. A warm breeze brushed against his cheek, carrying with it that same lavender and old paper scent he had noticed earlier. The shelves around him creaked in unison, as though shifting to acknowledge the name. Michael felt his heartbeat slow, steady, sinking once more with the quiet, ancient breath of the house. He turned to a new shelf, drawn by the soft whisper of paper settling. A row of journals, bound in faded leather, leaned together like old friends, protecting secrets between them. One journal in particular seemed to glow faintly at the edges, a soft amber aura that matched the lantern light. He reached for it. The leather was warm, almost comforting. When he opened it, the first page revealed Elara's handwriting, Lupin, familiar in a way that made his chest ache with a longing he couldn't explain. October 19th, 1894, the house spoke his name again. The one who will return. The one the house remembers even when the world forgets. I have dreamt of him for weeks now, walking through the corridor, looking at my portrait as though he's lived a lifetime before this one. I believe he is near. I believe he will find this place. Michael's breath caught in his throat. Eredon. The house is patient, kinder than people understand. It holds memories not as ghosts, but as kakos, soft and lingering. It knows him. It has always known him. A warm stillness wrapped around him, smoothing the edges of his confusion with a deep, inexplicable peace. It was as though the house itself leaned in, whispering reassurance, not through words, but through presence. He turned another page, and another, drawn deeper into Elara's quiet voice. Her entries described nights of listening to the house breathe, days of wandering through rooms that shifted with memory. Moments of sensing someone just beyond reach, someone she believed was bound to return to the house long after she was gone. Someone whose footsteps she had heard in dreams. Someone whose shadow she had seen reflected in old glass panes. Someone named Michael Alden. He closed the journal softly, hugging its warmth to his chest. The truth brushed the edge of his mind like a feather, gentle, impossible, strangely soothing. The house remembered him. Elara remembered him, but how? And why? Above him, the floorboards moaned softly, not in warning but in invitation, like a lullaby drifting down from another room. The lantern's flame steadied, breathing slow. The warmth in the basement deepened, and Michael, holding Ilera's journal against his heart, felt the threads of a story older than time weaving quietly around him, drawing him deeper into the house that knew his name long before he ever stepped inside. Michael lingered in the warm hush of the basement. Ilera's journal pressed lightly against his palm as though it were a heartbeat of its own, steady, patient, rhythmic, echoing some truth he had not yet dared to accept. The lantern flame wavered softly, elongating shadows that curled around the shelves like drifting smoke. But even the darkness here felt gentle, familiar, almost tender. The house seemed to hum faintly around him, a quiet vibration in the wooden beams, as though it welcomed the way his presence stirred its long-held memories. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting his breath slow, allowing the sensation of being held by warmth, by story, by something ancient and remembering, too, wrap around him like a heavy quilt on a winter night. When he opened his eyes again, the journal had settled open in his hands to another entry. Even though he did not recall turning the pages, the ink shimmered faintly, as though lit from beneath by the past itself. October 20th, 1894. I felt him in the house tonight, a soft presence near the stairs, like a shadow I recognized but could not see. The house spoke his name again, whispered it through the floorboards. Not a warning, a welcome, a longing. Michael traced the words lightly, feeling their warmth seep through his fingertips. A strange sense of comfort settled into his bones, a sense that he was not alone. Here not truly. He read on. He will return, the house keeps telling me. Not in this lifetime, perhaps, but in one to come. I know this sounds like fantasy, but the house is old in ways our minds can barely hold. It remembers across seasons, across decades, across time itself. And it remembers him. The one who feels like a story unfinished. Michael exhaled slowly, the air slipping from his lungs in a soft, trembling sigh. The warmth of the basement seemed to deepen, pulling him into a quiet, dreamlike state where the boundary between then and now dissolved like ink in water. He turned the page, this time intentionally, and found a pressed flower nestled between the sheets, a pale lavender blossom, fragile yet perfectly preserved, its petals still carrying the faintest sweetness of long-faded summers. As he lifted it gently, a soft wind fluttered through the basement, although no windows were open. The air carried the unmistakable scent of lavender, warm and nostalgic, and the lantern flame bent toward him, as though bowing in recognition. Michael closed his eyes, breathing in the fragrance. It felt like a memory just out of reach, a hand brushing his cheek, a voice whispering his name in the dark. When he opened his eyes again, he found a new page exposed. This one held no words, only another sketch of Ilara. But this time, she wasn't standing on the porch. She was seated in the very basement where he now stood, a lantern beside her, the same journals lining the walls. And in the dim light of the sketch, she held the same lavender flower pinched delicately between her fingers. Beneath the drawing, in faint, almost erased pencil marks, were the words, "For when you return." Michael's breath faltered, but the house steadied him with its soft, pulsing warmth. The journal seemed to rise and fall with each inhale, each heartbeat, each whisper the house released into the dim air. He closed the book gently and set it back on the table. Then he turned slowly, feeling the house guide him, its presence like a gentle hand pressed to the center of his back. He climbed the stairs with deliberate calm, each step drawing him closer to the surface world but deeper into the house's memory. When he reached the first floor, twilight had melted fully into night. The windows glimmered with soft moonlight, silver washing over the furniture, pooling in corners like quiet water. The old portraits watched him from the hallway, and the woman Ilara seemed almost alive in the blue glow, her eyes luminous, her expression softened by something like relief. Michael moved toward the living room again, drawn by an irresistible pull, and found the rocking chair swaying gently once more. This time, the rhythm matched his heartbeat so perfectly it felt intentional. He stood very still, letting the calm of the house flow into him. The past and present seemed to move together now, weaving like two rivers meeting in the quiet dark. Somewhere deep within the walls, the house whispered again, a sound not made of words, but of recognition, of welcome, of memory unfolding. Michael closed his eyes, and the whisper settled warmly around him, like a story that finally knew where it belonged. Michael stood in the center of the living room, letting the moonlit stillness settle around him like a soft, cool veil. The rocking chair swayed gently, its motion slow and steady, as if guided by a careful, unseen hand determined not to disturb the quiet that had settled deeply into the walls. He felt the warmth of the house breathed around him, subtle, rhythmic, ancient as though each wooden beam carried a memory of nights just like this one. Nights when someone listened, someone waited, someone remembered. He moved slowly toward the fireplace, drawn by the faint scent of old ash and warm cedar. The hearth was cold now, but his fingertips tingled as they brushed its stone edge, as if recalling fires long extinguished. The glow of the lantern from the basement still clung faintly to his vision, mingling with the moonlight until the entire room shimmered with an almost dreamlike haze. The brass key rested in his pocket, warm against his thigh, pulsing in gentle rhythm with his heartbeat. It felt less like an object now, and more like a living thread stitching him deeper into the story unfolding around him. His gaze drifted to the doorway leading back to the corridor of portraits. The house seemed to nudge him, whispering him forward. He walked with slow, measured steps, each footfall soft against the aging floorboards. The portraits glowed gently beneath the silver light filtering through the windows, each frame wrapped in delicate, shifting shadow. He passed the stern old man, the boy with the wooden train, the serene woman with the sad eyes, and then he reached her again, Ilara. In the moonlight, her painted gaze shimmered with a softness that tugged at his heart. The portrait seemed almost new now, as if restored by his presence. The colors deepened, the shadows gentler. Michael stepped closer, breath slowing to a deep, quiet rhythm. "Elara," he whispered, her name sliding from his lips like a memory resurfacing after years of slumber. The house answered with a soft, resonant creak, like a sigh of recognition rising from the deepest part of its foundation. He reached up and touched the edge of her frame. A gentle warmth spread beneath his fingertips, a warmth that reminded him of the lavender-scented pages of her journal, of the glow that had surrounded her in the sketch, of the invisible presence he had felt near him since he stepped inside. His touch drifted lower, brushing the carved wooden molding beneath the portrait. To his surprise, the wood shifted slightly under his hand, as though loosening itself. He pressed gently. A soft click echoed through the hall. A hidden panel slid open, revealing a narrow recess behind the wall. Inside, wrapped in delicate linen yellowed with age, lay a small wooden box. The house seemed to hold its breath. Michael lifted the box carefully, the linen falling away to reveal a delicate engraving across the lidan, intricate swirl of vines and stars, surrounding a single carved initial. His fingertips trembled, not with fear, but with a deep quiet. He opened the box slowly. Inside lay a folded letter sealed with brittle red wax, and beneath it, a silver locket shaped like a teardrop. The locket glowed faintly in the moonlight, as though remembering every hand that had ever held it. He lifted the letter first. The seal broke with a soft whisper. The handwriting on the page was unmistakably Elara's, gentle, looping, steady. "For the one the house remembers," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then the house has done what it has always promised. It has brought you home." Michael's breath caught, his heartbeat slowing further into a soft, hypnotic rhythm as he read on. "I do not know your name in this life, but I know your presence. I have felt it in the walls, in the floors, in the quiet spaces between night and morning. The house has shown me fragments of futures I cannot fully understand, but I know this: you have walked here before. You will walk here again, and whatever binds you to this place is not a curse, but a calling." His vision blurred for a moment, not with fear, but with an overwhelming sense of belonging, deep, impossible, soothing. He set the letter down gently and lifted the locket. It opened with a soft click. Inside was a tiny charcoal sketch of Elara on one side, and on the other, a name etched in delicate script, Alden. His chest tightened, not in panic, but in recognition so deep it felt like the quiet opening of a door he had always known, but never dared to look through. The house released a soft, warm creak, like a lullaby settling into the night. The rocking chair stilled, the moonlight deepened, and Michael, holding the locket that bore both Elara's likeness and his own forgotten name, felt the past and present fold gently together around him, as if the house itself were wrapping him in a memory long overdue. As the story fades, allow yourself to drift into a peaceful sleep. If you're enjoying this gentle, eerie bedtime tale, don't forget to subscribe, like, and support the channel so more stories like this can find their way to you in the quiet hours of the night. The staircase welcomed me with a long, low groan, not of warning, but of recognition, as though it had been waiting many quiet decades for the familiar weight of my step. And as I ascended, into the dim upper hall, the air thickened with the tender hush of old dust and forgotten seasons, wrapping gently around my shoulders like a shawl stitched from memories, each thread whispering fragments of a life I had never lived, yet somehow remembered in the deep, soft chambers of instinct. And the moonlight pooling through the warped window at the far end stretched itself thin across the floorboards, forming a pale path that seemed almost intentional, guiding, inviting, and I followed it slowly, my breath steady, my mind drifting into that lull between waking and dreaming where the world feels malleable and every sound echoes with something more than meaning, something older, something patient, and as my fingers brushed the faded wallpaper, I felt that same warm tingle, that quiet pull of familiarity, like tracing the face of a relative only half remembered from childhood, and the house responded with a sound so soft it felt more like a breath than a voice. A long exhale from behind the closed door to my left, a room whose brass knob gleamed faintly even in the weak light, polished not by present hands, but by intention, by a kind of memory so strong it lingered even after the living had gone. And with each slow step I felt the boundaries of time thin, the decades folding inward like gentle pages turning beneath invisible fingertips. And the closer I drew to that door, the more the sensations deepened, the air thickening with the scent of old cedar, dried lavender, and something faintly metallic, like the lingering taste of a story that had ended too abruptly to rest. And though any ordinary traveler might have hesitated, I felt a calm curiosity blooming in my chest, warm, steady, serene, as if the house were guiding me toward a truth it believed I was finally ready to hold. And when my hand closed around the cool brass knob, the warmth of the house surged gently beneath my palm, not urgent, not frightening, simply present, connected, alive, as though the walls themselves were leaning in to watch, to listen, to remember. And when I finally turned the knob and pushed the door open, the darkness inside unfolded like velvet, soft and deep, shimmering with the quiet energy of a space that had not been disturbed for almost a century, yet felt inexplicably aware of my arrival. And in that thick, gentle shadow I sensed not danger, but history, layered and waiting. And as I stepped inside, the floor seemed to sigh, the house seemed to breathe, and the past seemed ready to rise through the silence and speak. The darkness of the room wrapped around me like a heavy velvet curtain, not suffocating but comforting in a strange, ancestral way. And as my eyes adjusted to the gentle hush inside, I saw the faint outline of a narrow bed pressed against the far wall, its iron frame curled into elegant shapes, softened now by time and shadows. And beside it stood a small writing desk, its surface layered with dust, except for a single circular patch where something had once rested. Something recently moved, or deliberately taken, and the sight of that untouched ring felt like a heartbeat in the dark, a reminder that this house had been awake long before my arrival, watching, remembering, arranging its memories, with a care that bordered on devotion. And as I stepped farther inside, the air shifted with a soft stirring, a slow, deep breath released by the room itself, as though acknowledging my presence and I felt that familiar ripple of recognition flutter beneath my ribs again, subtle yet certain, as if I were walking into a version of my own forgotten childhood, into a history rewritten by shadows. And with every quiet step, the floorboards whispered a name I could almost hear, but not yet understand. A name that sent a warm shiver down my spine. A name the house had been holding on to for decades, waiting for the right moment to return it to me. And when I reached the small desk, the moonlight stretched itself thin across the floor, climbing gently onto the wooden surface to reveal a faint outline of handwriting etched into the grain. Not carved, but pressed into the wood by a hand that had written with too much emotion, too much urgency. And my fingertips traced the grooves slowly, feeling the soft rise and fall of each letter, each curve of a story long sealed beneath the weight of silence. And the moment my skin touched the final line, a hush rolled through the room, deep and warm, as if the house itself were exhaling in relief, recognizing the return of someone or something it had lost. And then a sound drifted from the corner behind me, soft as fabric brushing against fabric, a movement so gentle it might have been nothing more than the settling of old timber. Yet it carried with it a strange familiarity, a presence that felt neither threatening nor distant, simply watching with quiet anticipation. And when I slowly turned toward the sound, the air shimmered faintly, the shadows pooling into a softer shape, almost human in form, though not entirely defined, like a memory struggling to take shape after too many years. In the dark, and though any ordinary visitor might have frozen with fear, I felt only calm, a serene heaviness settling through my limbs, as though the presence meant no harm, as though it had been waiting for me, specifically, patiently, lovingly. And in that stillness, the house seemed to lean closer, eager, hopeful, ready for the story it had guarded so faithfully to finally be heard. Asterisk, the shadowy figure lingered in the corner with such stillness that the air around it seemed to thicken. Yet, instead of fear, I felt a slow, spreading warmth, a sensation like stepping into a room where someone has been waiting patiently with a story held gently between their palms. And as the moonlight shifted across the wooden floor in a long, delicate sweep, the figure's outline softened further, its presence pulsing faintly like a heartbeat syncing with my own. And I realized that nothing in the room felt hostile, nothing felt cold or cruel or sharp. Instead, everything hummed with a quiet longing, a yearning for recognition that seemed to press lightly against my chest as though urging me to remember something I had never actually known. And as I stood there, breathing in the old cedar scent and the faint sweetness of dried lavender lingering from a century past, the figure took a single step forward, its movement so subtle and graceful that the air barely stirred. Yet with that step came a wave of emotion so gentle and deep it felt, like a memory passed down through blood rather than lived experience. A sorrow not my own, yet woven into the fabric of my being. And in that soft, tidal pull of feeling I sensed the truth that this house, this room, this presence carried a story shaped by choices, by quiet grief, by a past that had been folded away too soon. And as my eyes adjusted further, I could make out the faint shimmer of something clasped close to the figure's chest, a small rectangular shape that caught the moonlight with a dim, familiar glow. A glow that tugged at me with a strange tenderness, and the realization rose slowly, like the tide creeping up a moonlit shore, that whatever the figure held belonged to me, or to someone whose story flowed into mine through long, tangled branches of family and fate. And when the figure extended its hand, offering the object with emotion so careful it felt like a lullaby, the room seemed to deepen, the shadows drawing closer, not in menace, but in gentle witness. And my steps toward it felt weightless, guided, inevitable, as though I were walking through a dream crafted from the house's own memories. And as I reached out, my fingers trembling not with fear, but with the soft tremor of recognition, the object grew clearer. A small leather-bound journal, edges worn, spine cracked, ink stains scattered like constellations across its surface. And the instant my fingertips brushed the cover, a warm pulse surged through the room, through the floorboards, through the air, as though the house itself sighed with long-awaited relief. And the presence before me shimmered, its form brightening for the briefest moment, revealing not a face, but an impression, a feeling, a deep echo of kinship. And in that hushed moment suspended between past and present, I understood that the story of this house was now mine to uncover, to carry, to remember. And the presence slowly stepped back into the darkness as the journal settled into my hands with the weight of a century of untold truth. The journal felt warm in my hands, as though it had absorbed the quiet pulse of the house over countless sleepless nights. And as I held it against my chest, the air in the room shifted with a gentle reverence, the way a congregation might fall silent when an old hymn begins. And I sensed that every floorboard, every shadow, every lingering breath of cedar and lavender was leaning in with a tender expectancy, waiting for me to open what had been sealed in darkness for nearly a century. And with slow, steady breaths I lifted the fragile cover, the leather releasing a soft sigh, as though exhaling years of restraint. And the first page unfurled beneath my fingers, its edges yellowed, its ink faded to a soft sepia tone, yet the handwriting remained graceful, deliberate, elegant in the way people wrote when paper was scarce and words were chosen with care. And the name at the top of the page made my pulse stutter in an eerie, tranquil way, for it was a name that lived only in the distant branches of my family's whispered stories, a name spoken rarely and always with a hint of sorrow, Margaret Blackwood. And the moment I traced the curve of the final letter, the room seemed to tighten with recognition, the shadows pressing closer, not in threat, but in longing. And I felt the fragile tether of blood and history drawing me deeper, urging me gently onward. So I read the first lines in a whisper, my voice blending into the stillness, until it felt like Margaret herself was breathing the words into my ear, and her story unfurled with a softness that carried a trembling undercurrent, describing a life built inside these walls, a life of quiet evenings, spent at the desk where I now stood, of warm autumn nights when the windows rattled softly with distant trains, of winters so cold the wallpaper curled at the edges and the house creaked like an old ship bracing against waves of icy wind. And woven through her words was a loneliness so tender it felt like a bruise, a longing for connection in a town that guarded its secrets too tightly, a town where the Blackwood name carried echoes of old mistakes and lingering accusations. And as the inked memories deepened, revealing hints of a choice she made, one that carried consequences far beyond her quiet room. The air around me wavered gently, shimmering with the weight of emotions preserved too long in silence, and I felt the house shift beneath my feet as though bracing itself, preparing me for truth that rested just beyond the turning of the next fragile page. Truth shaped not only by Margaret's sorrow, but by the hidden fractures in the Blackwood lineage, fractures that were now pulsing awake in the warm hush of the midnight hours, waiting to reveal themselves to the one descendant who had finally returned to listen. Asterisk. As I turned the next page, the journal released a faint rustle, a sound so delicate it felt like the soft flutter of wings in a forgotten attic. And the moment the paper settled, a deeper hush spread through the room, as though the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for me to absorb what Margaret had preserved in ink. And her handwriting grew shakier here, the strokes trembling with emotion, describing a night when the wind pressed hard against the shutters and the sky outside churned with restless clouds. A night when she sensed the weight of her family's past gathering at the edges of her thoughts like figures standing just beyond a lamplight's reach. And she wrote of hearing her name whispered through the hallway, not with menace, but with aching familiarity, as though someone long gone was searching for her, urging her to understand something she had tried too long to ignore. And the more I read, the more the room seemed to pulse with that same sorrowful rhythm, the air thickening with an emotion that was not mine but flowed into me with a slow inevitability, an echo of a burden carried quietly through generations. And Margaret described the moment she realized the truth she had tried to evade, that the house was not merely haunted by memory, but bound to the Blackwood bloodline itself, holding stories the town had buried, choices that had shaped its fate, wounds left unspoken for fear of sparking old tensions between neighbors who still clung to long after the original conflict had faded into rumor. And as my fingers traced the ink, a gentle shiver moved through the floorboards beneath me, a soft groan that felt almost like agreement, or perhaps affirmation. And I felt the presence from the corner return, not with form but with a shift in the temperature of the air, a warmth blooming against my back, like the touch of a hand, urging me to keep reading, to go deeper, to follow Margaret's final confession. And her next lines revealed that she had made a choice, one she believed would protect the family, one rooted in sacrifice rather than fear, but she never wrote what the choice was, the sentence trailing off into a jagged line as though something had interrupted her at the desk. Or perhaps she could not bear to write the conclusion, and the gap in her words left a hollow ache in me, a soft ringing silence that carried the weight of untold truth. And as I stood there, the journal trembling faintly in my hands, the house responded with a long, low sigh, a sound filled with the ache of time, urging me toward the final page, the final truth. The moment where Margaret's story and mine would finally meet in the quiet center of the night. The final page trembled beneath my fingertips as though it held not ink but a pulse, a quiet heartbeat preserved across decades. And when I eased it open, the air in the room thickened with a profound stillness, the kind that settles over a landscape just before snowfall, softening every edge, every lingering ache. And Margaret's handwriting here was slower, heavier, each stroke pressed deep into the paper, as though she wanted her final truth to root itself firmly in whoever eventually found these words. And as my eyes traveled across the page, The story she had carried alone unfurled with a fragile, aching clarity, revealing that her choice the one she never had the strength to finish, describing to us a decision to bind her own restless spirit to the house, so that the bitterness of the town, the old accusations and unspoken wounds, would not consume the Blackwood legacy entirely. And she wrote of a night when she stood at the threshold between the upstairs hall and this room, listening to the house breathe around her, feeling the weight of generations pressing softly on her shoulders. And she placed the journal on the desk as though leaving a lantern for someone yet unborn, someone who would step through the door long after her voice had faded, someone the house itself would recognize, draw home, and guide gently toward the truth. And as I reached the final lines, her last words glowed faintly in the pale wash of moonlight, her message written not with fear, but with a tender, tired hope. If you are reading this, then the house has chosen to trust again. You carry our name. You carry what I could not finish. Do not fear the shadows. They remember you. And the moment I finished the sentence, a warm hush rippled through the room. The presence from the corner returning not as a figure this time but as a gentle pressure, a calm embrace that wrapped itself around me with the weightless familiarity of family, and the shadows lifted, softening into a comforting stillness, as though Margaret herself were acknowledging that her long vigil could finally ease, that her story no longer had to echo alone in the wooden ribs of the house. And I felt the walls relax, the floor beneath my feet settling into a peaceful quiet, the entire home exhaling after nearly a century of holding its breath. And in that serene twilight glow, I pressed the journal to my chest and let my eyes drift closed, feeling the deep, soothing rhythm of the house align with my own heartbeat, steady, calm, protective. And as the night wrapped its soft arms around me, a whisper brushed through the warm air, not from the shadows but from the very memory of the place, a gentle promise that the worst of the story had passed and the rest would unfold with patience, with warmth, with the guiding touch of those who had waited in silence for far too long. And as this chapter fades, allow your breath to slow, your mind to soften, and let yourself drift into a peaceful sleep. And if you wish to continue exploring these midnight murmurs with me, I invite you to subscribe, support the channel, and return whenever the night calls softly for another story.